Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this morning. As Jo said, I'm going to be talking about a paper which I've been working on with some colleagues. You can see the paper listed on that front page. It's all about childcare and whether having access to childcare can help parents to work more. So just to add to what Jo said, I'm a reader in the department here at Birmingham, and I'm also affiliated with an organisation called the Institute for Fiscal Studies. That's a kind of policy organisation which does academic research and also lots of policy work in London. So some of the colleagues that I've co-authored with are based there. So as you or maybe family and friends might have experienced over the last few months, I think it's fair to say that having someone to help look after your children is pretty vital to enable parents to work or to work effectively. And for that reason, it's perhaps not surprising that over the last 20 or 30 years, the vast majority of countries in the OECD have introduced policies which have tried to either subsidise childcare for parents or to offer it for free. So why might they do that? What do we think might be the impact of such policies on parents' labour supply? Well, I think we start from a base of thinking that perhaps if these policies weren't there, parents would otherwise be paying for childcare or paying more for childcare. And of course, what that effectively does is act as a tax on the parents' wages. So it's going to reduce the amount of money that they take home from every hour of work that they're being paid for. And essentially what that's going to mean is that the reservation wage that that parent has, the wage that they would hope to receive in order to enter the labour market, for example, would be higher. So they would need to be paid more in order to be enticed into the labour market, because they know that part of that wage is going to have to go straight out of the door to pay for childcare. So that, of course, as you'll know from your first and second year courses, is going to mean that it's probably much less likely that parents are going to work or to work longer hours. And I'll come back to that point a bit later. So how might the introduction of a government subsidy help this situation? How might it affect parents' labour supply? Well, as we've just talked about, this paying for childcare effectively acts like a tax on wages. So a policy to subsidise that childcare is effectively going to reduce that tax. And as you'll know from your courses, whether a parent is in work or not is going to affect their response to a reduction in their tax on wages. Why is that? Well, it comes back to the old concepts of the income and substitution effects. So for a parent who's not in work, the effect is going to be unambiguously positive. So for a parent who's not in work, a policy which reduces the tax on their wages is going to reduce their reservation wage. It's going to make work more attractive. So some may be induced to enter the labour market. Those whose reservation wage is now below the market wage that they would be paid will find it more attractive to enter the labour market. So that's the substitution effect, and it's unambiguously positive. If there were no parents in work, this policy was unambiguously increase the number of parents who were in work. The situation is obviously a little bit different for parents who are already in work, because there we not only have the positive substitution effect, but also potentially the negative income effect. So the substitution effect works in the same way. If a parent is thinking about working an additional hour, then they are now going to be taking home more of the money that they would be paid because of this reduction in the cost of childcare. So they might be induced to work more hours. On the other hand, given that they are already working a set number of hours, they would have already had a certain amount of take-home pay. Effectively, this policy is going to reduce the cost of the childcare that they're already paying for. That's going to mean that their take-home pay is higher than it would otherwise have been. And in fact, that might actually induce some parents to choose to work less rather than more. So obviously the effect of the policy on the parents who are in work is ambiguous a priori. We'd need to look at the empirical evidence to know what effect it had for those parents. So as you might expect, because of the introduction of so many policies, there's also a lot of research which has looked at the effect of these policies. In most cases, people focus on the effect of mothers' labour supply. So they look at how this policy is going to affect women's participation in the labour market or employment. We, in our paper, looked at both mothers and fathers and essentially found zero effect on fathers. So I think this focus is kind of justified by what we're seeing in the data. So the evidence that it kind of is in the literature is there's a lot of different papers from a lot of different countries, but I think kind of a nutshell summary of what they found is that there's a wide range of estimates, but generally the effects are greater in countries where there's low female labour force participation to begin with, so in situations where there are not already very many women in work, and also in countries where the alternative childcare options are either kind of not very plentiful, there's not much childcare available, or it's more expensive. So you can imagine again a situation where a subsidy to that childcare or the provision of additional childcare might have a bigger effect than in a country where there's already a robust private market offering relatively low cost childcare. So that's kind of what the literature has looked at to date. But actually, if you look at discussions across many of these countries, cost of childcare remains a big concern for a lot of parents. It's not that these policies seem to have solved the problem, if you like. So many countries, including the UK, have either recently introduced or are considering increasing the subsidies available. They're expanding those policies. So what we are interested in is what the impact of those policies might be. And actually, there's not so much evidence of that in the academic literature to date. So why might it be important to look at this? Why might we not just be able to extrapolate from what we already know? Well, I guess there's a couple of reasons. The first is the effects might be non-linear. What do I mean by that? I mean that, let's say you had a situation where parents were paying £10 per hour for childcare. A policy was then introduced which reduced the cost of that childcare by £2 per hour to £8 an hour. That will have had some effect that has been analysed in the literature. Let's say there would then be a further reduction in the cost of childcare from £8 per hour to £6 per hour, for example. Could we just assume that the reduction from £10 to £8 an hour would produce the same effect on parents' labour supply as the reduction from 8 to 6? Not necessarily. It could be that there are kind of kinks in the effect, that the responsiveness of parents to changes at certain price levels is not the same as at others. Perhaps it would be bigger if it was reduced from 8 to 6. Perhaps it would be lower if it was reduced from 8 to 6 compared to 10 to 8. We just don't know. And I guess related to that, going back to the point we discussed in a previous slide about the income and substitution effects, it's not obviously going to be the same parents who are affected by these different policies. If, for example, the reduction in the price of childcare from £10 to £8 an hour has already induced some more parents to enter the labour market, then perhaps the composition of the group who are affected will comprise more of those who are already in work and less of those who are not. So perhaps the income effect might start to weigh a little more heavily in that situation. It might also be the case that the people who are on the margin of participating in the labour market now have quite different characteristics than they did before. So maybe their preferences for working are much weaker than those who had already been induced to enter the labour market. So for those reasons, it might not be the case that we can just look at what's already been studied in terms of the effect of introducing childcare subsidies and extrapolate from that to what we might expect the effect to be of expanding those subsidies. And that's essentially the kind of gap or the question we're trying to look at in this paper. So we are focusing on England, which has slightly different childcare policies to the other countries in the UK. And essentially, we're trying to look at a situation where access to free childcare was extended from half a school day to a whole school day. So effectively a situation from where a child is getting about 3 hours of free childcare a day to where they're getting more like 6 or 6.5 hours a day. And to do that, we're comparing parents in two situations. The first is those who have preschool children who have not yet started school. Now, since about 2004, those children have been entitled to 15 hours a week of free childcare during school term time, and they're entitled to that from the term after they turn 3. I'll come back to that in a minute and give you a more concrete example of what that means. The other situation that we're going to look at is parents who have school-age children, so children who are old enough to have started school. And as I mentioned, that gives roughly 30 to 35 hours a week of what you can think of as free childcare, although childcare is obviously not the primary motive for the school system. And they generally access that from the September after they turn 4. So that's earlier than in lots of other countries around the world, but that is pretty common for the majority of children in England now. So what are we going to do? Are we just going to compare the labour supply, the labour market outcomes of all parents who have preschool age children and all parents who have school age children, and use that to understand what the impact of this increase in free childcare might be? The bottom line is no, we're not going to do something quite as straightforward as that, although it's not much more complicated than that. And the reason why is that there is an independent relationship between children's age and mother's labour supply. So mothers tend to work more as their children get older. And that's pretty constant if you look from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and so on, actually up to quite relatively older age children, up to the end of primary school, for example. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because if we didn't properly account for that independent relationship of children's age on mother's labour supply, we would end up overestimating the effect of being able to access a whole day of free childcare as opposed to half a day of free childcare. Why is that? Because we'd be comparing children who are older, who get access to that whole day of free childcare at school, and those who are younger who get access to the half day of free childcare in a nursery, for example. And it might appear that some of the labour supply differences, it might appear that they're quite big, but actually some of that would probably be simply because parents of school-age children, their children are older, and not because of the difference in the childcare policy. So what are we going to do in our paper? We're essentially going to exploit those rules which govern who can access a half day of care or a whole day of care, which I described a couple of slides ago, and compare parents of children who are pretty much the same age, but who, because of the rules around these policies, actually are entitled to different amounts of free care. So let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. As I described the policies, I talked about children being entitled to a half day of care from the term after they turn 3 and a whole day of care from the September after they turn 4. So essentially there are going to be discontinuities in who is entitled to these different amounts of care, which are driven by the term starting dates. So the academic year in England, commonly to that for the university system, in schools it runs from the 1st of September to the 31st of August. So if you are entitled to start school in the September after you turn 4, then a child born on the 31st of August, for example, in 2015, will be able to enter school on the 1st of September 2019, when they have just turned 4. For a child born just a day later, on the 1st of September 2015, for example, they won't have turned 4 by the time that academic year begins, so they'll have to wait a whole extra year before they're able to start. So they won't actually be able to start school until the 1st of September 2020. So that discontinuity in access to school is quite a big one. You have to wait a whole year before you can enter the school system. But in terms of the half day care, as I mentioned, you're entitled from the term after you turn 3. So for those children born on the 31st of August 2015, they would be entitled to that half day of care from the 1st of September 2018, while the children born just a day later on the 1st of September would be entitled at the beginning of the next term, which starts on the 1st of January Should have been 2020, apologies, that's a typo in my slides. So you can see that just children who are born a day apart from each other, who you might expect are not different in very many other ways, are actually receiving quite different entitlements to free care. So those born on the 1st of September are having to wait a term later for their half day of care and a year later for their whole day of care. And why does that help us? Well, it essentially means that we can look at the labour supply, the labour market outcomes of parents who have children of very similar ages at a time when their treatment is going to be quite different. So at a time when some are going to be able to access nothing, some are going to be able to access half a day of care, some are going to be able to access a whole day of care. So just kind of discussing, going back to the discontinuity we were just talking about around the 1st of September, thinking about when the children were entitled to that half day of care. If we look at the period, the first term when those August born children are entitled, that is between September and December 2018, then the parents of those children will have access to half a day of care, and the parents of the slightly younger children will have access to no free childcare. So if we compare their labour market outcomes, that should tell us about the causal impact of being able to access half a day of free care a week. And similarly, if we compare the outcomes of parents of children of those ages in that period where the younger children are entitled to be in school and the older children are not, it will tell us about the difference between being able to access a whole day of free childcare versus a half day of free childcare. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing. We're going to be comparing the labour market outcomes of parents of children with very similar ages at different points in time when those children have different entitlements to free care. We're also going to be thinking about whether duration matters. What do I mean by that? I mean, does it matter whether a child has been entitled to free part-time or full-time care for a term or 2 terms or 3 terms or 4 terms and so on? Does the amount of care, the length of time they've been receiving care matter? Why might it? I guess it might if it takes parents time to find a job, for example, or if they decide to wait and see whether their child has settled effectively into school before they start looking for work. So we might think that the effect would increase as time passes and the child is more settled in the setting. They've been entitled to childcare for longer. So essentially we can do this in one of 2 ways. Either we can compare the parents of these children born around this 1st of September discontinuity at other times of the year. So I talked on the previous slide about how if we looked at people in the first term, the kind of autumn term, the September to December 2018 period, that would tell us about the effect being entitled to 0 versus the first term of half-day care. If we then track forward an extra term and we look at parents between January and March 2019, for example, that's going to tell us whether there's any effect of being entitled to half a day of care in your first term versus your second term. And similarly, we roll forward another term to the summer term, and that's going to tell us about the effect of being entitled to a half day of care in your third term versus your second term, for example. And the other way that we can do it is by exploiting other discontinuities, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So how do we kind of implement this approach that I've just described in the paper? We do it in 2 ways. Why do we do it in 2 ways? Because these different approaches have different advantages and disadvantages. And so by doing both, if they tell us the same story, which they do in our case, thankfully, that kind of strengthens the evidence that we're able to present in the paper. I'm just going to discuss one of the methods today, and that method is called regression discontinuity design. The other method is a panel data approach, where we try and look at repeated observations on parents over time and include fixed effects to account for unobservable heterogeneity. So what is regression discontinuity design? Well, essentially it's what I've just described in words. It's a method which relies on there being a rule to determine who gets treated and who doesn't, or that determines the probability that you might be treated. So what do I mean by that? So a rule that determines treatment might be, for example, if you were interested in the effect of being old enough to buy alcohol on consumption of alcohol, for example, you could compare people who had just turned 18 with those who were just less than 18, and the kind of treatment you'd be looking at is, are you legally old enough to buy alcohol in the UK? And you could look at that on whichever outcomes you had of interest. So you know that everybody who's 18 is legally entitled and everybody who's 17 is not. And you can, so that is changing the probability of treatment from 0 to 1, and you can look at that effect on outcomes. If you change the probability of treatment, it might be a situation something like, let's say you took a test, and if you scored below 40% on that test, you were offered some kind of remedial education classes. You didn't have to take them, but you were offered the opportunity of using them. Whereas if you scored above 40%, you weren't offered that. So it could be that not everybody who was offered the extra class decided to take it. So it's not that everyone with a score below 40 is treated, was in that remedial class, but a proportion of them probably would be. So essentially we're focusing on the rules, these kind of rules that have cut-offs that are observable to researchers that change somebody's probability of treatment. And why does that help us? Well, essentially, as I alluded to before, it means that it produces a kind of arbitrary cut-off which shouldn't matter in terms of outcomes, apart from the fact that it determines treatment. So in our case, you could think that children who are born one day apart shouldn't be different from each other. They should have, or the parents of those children shouldn't be different from each other. The chance of that parent being in work shouldn't differ dramatically simply because their child was a day older or younger, apart from the fact that it induces this change in treatment, this entitlement to free part-time or full-time free childcare. So essentially, we're kind of assuming that individuals either side of these cutoffs are essentially identical. So if you compare the outcomes of people in that situation, you can identify the causal effect of the treatment you're interested in. So in our case, we can get the causal effect of being offered different amounts of free childcare. So in our paper, we implement the regression discontinuity approach by using census data. So we use data from the census, that is the kind of record of all people living in the UK on a particular date, which happened to be in March 2011. So it collects some basic information about those individuals, including whether they're parents, the dates of birth of those children, and the labour market outcomes of those parents, those individuals. So that essentially gives us everything we need in order to be able to implement this approach. The specific treatment effects it allows us to calculate, there are 5 of those. So the first is we can look at children who are born either side of 1st of September 2006. So for example, the 31st of August versus the 1st of September 2006. The children who were born on the 31st of August will be in school on that census date. They will be entitled to be in school, whereas those who were born on the 1st of September will not. They'll still be waiting to enter school the following September. So that enables us to compare the impact of accessing half versus a whole day of free care. And then we're also able to get 4 treatment effects of on the effect of access to half-day care. So nothing versus the first term, first versus second, second versus third, third versus fourth. And we essentially do that by comparing children born either side of slightly different discontinuities. So obviously the census date is one date. We've got information on whether somebody is in work or looking for work on one date in March 2011. So in order to get variation in those number of terms that people are entitled to, we need to use slightly different discontinuities. So for example, if we take the 1st of January 2008 discontinuity, So the people who were born just a day before that, on the 31st of December 2007, they'll turn 3 on the 31st of December 2010, and therefore be eligible to access half a day of care from January 2011 and be in that first term of care in March 2011 when the census takes place. Whereas those born just that day later in January won't be able to access free care until the summer term in 2011, so they won't be entitled on the census date, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that's not too bamboozling for you. Essentially, I'm just going to show you some pictures which capture our results, and hopefully that will make it a little more clear. If it's a bit confusing so far, hopefully it'll make it a little bit more clear exactly what we're doing and who we're comparing with who. So this picture shows, it plots on the, well, it shows you on the left, on the x-axis, it plots the age of the youngest child on the census date. And we look at all children in our paper, but essentially, and this is common across the literature, you only ever really find effects of access to childcare based on the age of the youngest child in your family. Why might that be? Well, of course, if you've got a child who's eligible to start school, but you've also got a baby at home, for example, that is unlikely to have as big an effect on your labour force participation as having your youngest child about to start school. So we're always focusing on youngest children here. So it's plotting age across that x-axis in days. So that's running from about the time a child is 2 3/4 to about the time they're 5. And essentially, each of those dots is plotting the percentage of mothers who are in the labour force, who are either in work or actively looking for work on the census date, according to the date of birth of their youngest child. And that is, so this is kind of aggregate data based on all mothers in the census, kind of compressed down into each of these dots, which represents the labour market participation of mothers whose youngest child is born on a specific date. And the graph, as you can see, is split into sections on the basis of those cut-offs that I just discussed. So you can see that obviously as age is increasing, the child's date of birth is going further back in time. So you can see across the top that the first discontinuity that we just talked about, the difference between the first term of part-time care and not being entitled to part-time care for children born around that 1st of January 2008 cut-off is the first vertical red line. We move progressively across, with the second red line being the effect of the second term versus the first term of part-time care, the third line being the effect of the third versus second term of part-time care, the fourth line being the effect of the fourth versus third term of part-time care, and then the final line, the one furthest to the right-hand side, labelled 1st of September 2006, is our discontinuity around whether you're entitled to half a day of care or a whole day of school care. And essentially those dots are the kind of underlying raw data, and then what these lines are is kind of very flexible polynomials which have been estimated separately in each of the sections A, B, C, D, E and F. So each of that kind of plots a trend for the kind of dots in that line, just for separately for those individual sections, for parents of children born between those dates. And essentially, if we see an effect of, or a different effect of being entitled to half day care or a whole day care, you would expect to see a jump in those lines. So the difference in the height of where those trends cross the vertical red lines is essentially our treatment effect. So you can see, looking at the effects of the half day care around the first 4 discontinuities, there's not really anything there. There isn't any difference in where the line on the left hand side is touching the red line and the line on the right hand side is touching the red line. So that's essentially telling us there's no effect of being entitled to part-time care relative to nothing, or relative to as the kind of as the time passes and you've been entitled to that care for longer and longer. There is an effect, however, of being entitled to a whole day of care versus half a day of care. So you can see that there's a jump between section E and section F, if you like, and that jump is telling us what is the impact of entitlement to a whole day of care versus half a day of care. And the answer is that it increases mothers' labour market participation by about 3.5 percentage points. That's the difference kind of signified on that y-axis. So we're seeing nothing in terms of the effect of part-time care, but a larger, if not dramatically large, effect of around 3.5 percentage points in terms of the proportion of women in work. So increasing it from about 66.5% to about 70% as a result of the youngest child being entitled to start school. And then this is a very similar graph, which is just doing exactly the same thing as I've just described, but where the outcome is whether you're in work as opposed to not, rather than whether you're in the labour market as opposed to not. And you can see again, there's not really anything there in terms of half-day care, but there's a jump, albeit a smaller one, when we move from half-day to whole-day care. And that jump is about 1.5 percentage points. So mothers of children who are entitled to a whole school day are about 1.5 percentage points more likely to be in work than mothers whose children are only entitled to half a day of free care. So the difference between about 61 and 62.5% in work, for example. So why might we see these results? So we didn't really see anything in terms of the effect of being offered to a free half a day of childcare as opposed to nothing. Why is that? Well, the reality is, and we looked at this using childcare data in our paper, for the vast majority of parents, this policy simply acted as an income transfer. So essentially they were already paying for childcare, and this money just enabled them to reduce their bills rather than inducing them to use more childcare. So there weren't that many parents who were not using any childcare who now started to use childcare as a result of this policy. There were some parents who were previously using what we call informal childcare. That means having their children looked after by friends or family, grandparents, for example. And they now switched to using what's called formal childcare, which is where this free care could be taken up. That means going to a nursery or a preschool, for example. And that may have had benefits in terms of children's development. So there's evidence which suggests that formal care is better for children's kind of school readiness and other socio-emotional skills than staying at home with parents. But it doesn't, kind of just switching the type of childcare you use is not having any impact on labour supply. It may also be the case, of course, that that's because there are not many jobs that you could fit around access to half a day of childcare a week. If parents weren't willing to supplement by buying more hours of childcare, for example, this might not have been enough inducement to move them into the labour force. We saw instead that there were larger benefits of moving from a half to a whole day of free care, which suggests that expansions of subsidies may be effective. But actually, I think our judgment was the effects are still pretty small for what is quite a large subsidy. So this is a universal policy in the UK. Every child is entitled to this free part-time childcare. And then, of course, every child starts school. And we might have expected to see more of a difference in terms of labour supply than I think we ended up seeing. There are a couple of things we're going to think about in future research, though, which I think kind of still leaves this question open a little bit. The first is whether this effect that we're identifying is just a timing effect or whether the differences might persist. So what do I mean by that? So if we were to look at parents of children, older children, so when they were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we compared the same parents around this same discontinuity, so it was effectively asking the question, does it matter for your labour supply whether your child started school 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 years ago? If the answer was no, then we could conclude that this effect we're seeing is just a timing effect. So it's bringing forward the labour market participation of some parents who would have gone into work anyway when their child got a bit older. On the other hand, if we were still seeing differences when children were older, that might tell us that this has a more kind of permanent effect, perhaps because the accumulation of experience starts to matter. So, for example, if you were going to compare the wages of parents of children of those ages, could you see any effect left over from the fact that they started school a year older or younger? So that's kind of, I think that's really important from a policy perspective, particularly because although we've looked at school here, in England, those preschool children have now been given access to more hours of free childcare a week. So it becomes more important to understand whether that additional payment, which is not to do with formal education for children in school, is cost effective for the government, if you like. And I think the second related to that point is, one concern with these results is that they're being driven in some way by social norms. So parents may just regard the time that their child goes to school as a kind of cut-off beyond which they would then start to look for work. And that might be the same regardless of however many hours of free childcare, in inverted commas, it delivered them. Whereas a policy that was focused on slightly younger children, the preschool children, as I just described, would we expect to see the same effect from a policy like that as opposed to the starting school policy? Or are these social norms an important part of what's driving these results? And again, that's going to be really important for understanding the cost effectiveness of these policies. And that's all I was going to say. So thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. I'll just close my screen so I can re-see the comment box.